to another powerful episode of Pleasure Principles, the podcast where we explore the messy, magical, and deeply meaningful terrain of intimacy, desire, and what it means to live a fully embodied life. Yes, I'm your host Avik, and today we are diving into one of the most common, confusing, and tender issues in long term relationships. Yes, like why do stable couples lose intimacy? And more importantly, how do we get it back? Right? So, our guest today is a powerhouse of insight and the compassion, Dr. Bruce Chalmer. So, welcome to the show, Dr. Bruce.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Amazing, amazing. So, Dr. Bruce, before we start, I'll quickly love to introduce you to all the listeners. Dear listeners, Dr. Bruce is a psychologist with over 30 years of experience helping couples navigate betrayal, boredom, communication breakdowns, and the many shades of sex. Yes, we are going in there from plain old sex to good sex to sacred sex. Yes. So he's the author of Reigniting the Spark. It's not about communication, and most recently, Betrayal and Forgiveness. So, books that are challenging the way we think about intimacy and emotional repair. So, dear listeners, whether you are in a stable but stuck relationship or reeling from betrayal or wondering what sacred sex even means, then you are going to want to lean in close for this one. Yeah. Let's get into it. Welcome to the show again, Dr. Bruce.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to talk about all those things.
Lovely. Great. So, Dr. Bruce, um, I mean, regarding the fade of intimacy, why do you think the stable couples so often lose that spark over time?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I often point out to the folks I work with, it's not because there's anything wrong with anybody. This happens in people who are, not having mental health issues per se. This happens in
Yeah.
regular old people having a relationship. What
Mm,
happens is people will find each other and get married and build a life together. And
mm,
when they do things like, get married, and when they do things like especially having children,
mm,
they start to really get emphasize the importance of stability in a relationship. Stability is really important. What I mean by stability is pretty simple. I just mean if things are stable, you're not particularly worried about them. There's not a lot of anxiety there. So as couples more and more privilege stability in their relationships,
mm,
what tends to happen is they start to worry about rocking the boat too much. So, for example, they might not bring up, simple complaints with each other. Just, somebody just wanting to say to the other one, hey, I wish you would do more of X, Y, or Z that you're not doing, or less of X, Y, or Z that you are doing, or something.
mm,
They won't say those things, and things will start to build up. And what they lose there is what I call, and using this term very broadly, intimacy. They lose intimacy. All I mean by intimacy, again, I mean, I'm not just talking about sex. I'm talking about it in a much broader sense. That sense, that feeling alive, that you can be who you are with your partner being who they are. That's what I mean by intimacy, being basically honest and present with yourself and each other. And
mm,
when they start to sacrifice that, and maybe they sacrifice it because they've tried to have some, discussions about things they differ on, and maybe those discussions haven't gone well. Maybe they've panicked, or somebody's gotten really angry, or they've gone into a deep
mm,
freeze, very common occurrences. Then they get even more reluctant to try that. And over time, excuse me, over time, the lack of intimacy itself becomes destabilizing. My favorite metaphor I like to use when I'm talking about stability and intimacy with couples is, if you think about a plant that is planted in fertile soil and it germinates and it sprouts and it starts to grow,
mm,
and then someone comes along and paves a sidewalk over it. And why would you do that? You do that for stability. That's why people pave sidewalks. It makes sense. That
mm,
plant is not just going to sit there. It's going to try and crack the sidewalk, or perhaps die trying. But it's not just going to sit there, because in a living organism, the roots provide stability, but intimacy is the energy for growth. And That applies every bit as much to human beings and also even to couples, which is itself a kind of organism, as it does to a plant. And so if you somehow get in the way of that energy for growth,
Mm.
it's going to become destabilizing. Now, what does it look like in a couple when the couple metaphorically tries to crack the sidewalk? Sometimes it looks like an affair. Sometimes it looks like they can't talk about anything without getting into either a big fight or a deep freeze.
Mm.
Sometimes it means their sex life just goes away completely. Sometimes it means somebody gets depressed and can't
Mm.
really figure out why. Sometimes it means somebody just kind of blindsides the other person by saying, I'm out of here, I can't take it anymore. All of those things are often symptoms of lack of intimacy.
True. Understood. Yeah. And like you have said that it's not about the communication,
Mhm.
and which is definitely counter to what we have been told. Like if you can break that myth.
Yes. Yeah, that's why I wrote that book. That's why I gave it such a sort of snarky title. You know, it's not about
Mhm.
communication. I want to mention the subtitle of that book too. The subtitle is Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong, and which is an even snarkier subtitle. The basic idea there is that almost all the people, there are occasional exceptions, but almost all the people I work with are actually just
Mhm.
fine at communicating. They're very effective at communicating. The problem isn't that they need to learn better tools for communication. The problem is what they are so effectively communicating. Often, what they're communicating are things like mistrust, contempt, anger,
Mm.
all sorts of things that are not exactly conducive to intimacy. And so helping couples through that isn't about learning better communication techniques so they can more effectively express how much they can't stand each other. It's
Mhm.
about getting it so that they actually go back to enjoying each other rather than being so angry. And that's a very different, those are very different conversations to have than ones about,
Yeah,
how do we communicate better?
that's the best part of it. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think many of us feel shame when that spark dims, like it's the personal failure. But the way you frame it, I mean, it's about the safety versus passion. So it's almost um, liberating. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean,
So
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, yeah, please, you please continue. Yeah.
No, I was just noting, agreeing. Yeah, it is.
Mm.
I hope it's liberating for folks. It is,
Mm.
in the first session with couples, I almost always give a little talk about the difference between stability and intimacy. And
Hmm.
very, very often, you can sort of see the light bulb moments
Mm.
happening for people. They're saying, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. And
Yeah.
most of the folks I'm working with have been uh, attending to stability a lot more than they are to intimacy because intimacy is scary. The chief skill of intimacy is tolerating anxiety rather than avoiding it.
Mm.
And it's not surprising we want to avoid anxiety. Anxiety is meant
Mm.
is designed by evolution to feel bad. It's a message from your body, But
Yes.
of course we want to avoid it, but if you avoid it too much, then you lose intimacy.
Hmm. True. Exactly. And also, like, um, as we all know, like we all heard and we've been taught, we've been known only sex is the only word. But as you described, there are three kinds, like
Mhm.
plain old good and sacred sex. I mean, what's the difference? I mean, why does it matter for the long term love?
Well, I'll explain what I mean by each of those.
Mm.
Plain old sex, I just mean anything you think of as sex. There's all kinds of things that
Mm.
people can classify as sex.
Yeah.
And even for plain old sex,
Hmm.
um, just even to be able to do that, you have to be able
Mm.
to not panic about it. When people have been, had some
Hmm.
sort of sexual trauma or a history of sexual trauma, often that gets in the way even of plain old sex. They'll avoid it and because it's terrifying.
Hmm.
So that often requires some healing to recover from trauma, even to be able to do that. When the distinction I make between plain old sex and good sex
Yeah.
is related to that concept of intimacy. That when you can be, and it's interesting in your introduction to this podcast, you talk about being fully embodied. I think that was the expression you used, or something similar to that. When you are fully present in your body and your mind and your spirit, and however else you want to say it, in the presence of your partner doing the same, that's what I mean by good sex. It's
Mhm.
you're actually present, and it is moment, sex can be an avenue for very, very deep intimacy.
Mhm.
So that's what I mean by good sex. Sacred sex is another step from that. So if you have plain old sex is just your physical intimacy, and
Mhm.
good sex is intimacy that is beyond the physical. It's also emotional and spiritual intimacy. What I mean by sacred sex is when it is beyond just the two people involved. It's when it becomes about something that is much greater forces than just the two of you. It's when it's an expression of some things, folks who are into tantra, it's very
Yeah.
much about that. And there are other traditions as well. Even in the West, there are traditions of sex being an avenue for a kind of communion with with the divine. Because the forces of sex are so powerful, it really does lend itself to that. You know, theoretically, anything could be sacred. You can have, you can
Yeah.
do the dishes in a sacred fashion too, if it's really all about, participating in the universe as a whole.
Mhm.
But sex is very amenable to that, although it's terrifying
Mhm.
because the forces are so powerful. But when a couple can experience that sense that it's not just about them, that's what I mean by sacred sex.
Mhm. True. Understood. Okay. And like, do couples need to earn their way to sacred sex, or is it accessible to everyone? I mean, what do you say?
Well, I think, elements of both. I mean, I
Mhm.
think you have to be I do think of it as sort of cumulative,
Mhm.
you have to be good at plain old sex to get to good sex, and then you have to
Mhm.
be good at good sex to get to sacred sex. The thing about the sacred is you can't just manufacture
Mhm.
it. Do you know what I mean? You can do all kinds of things to facilitate good sex, I think. For sacred sex, it's more about setting up the conditions where it then becomes possible, but I don't know how you can force it to happen.
Mhm.
That's true, I think, in any kind of spiritual practice,
Yeah.
meditation or prayer or whatever people do. You can have these moments of transcendence. You can't time them. You can't say, okay,
Mhm.
today I'm going to have a moment of transcendence, but you can set up the conditions where if it's going to happen, it's more likely. And I think that's true
Mhm.
of sacred sex as well.
Amazing. Yeah. So, and wow. So, I mean, when you walk, I mean, when you talk about the sacred sex, it feels like you are inviting into something deeper than the performance. So, it's about presence, connection, and even awe. So, that
Mm.
really shifts the conversation. I'd say, yeah, that's a great part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. That term awe is really an important part of it.
Hmm. Exactly. And like after betrayal, like in a book, Betrayal and Forgiveness, um you explore like what happens when trust is broken. So what's
Mhm.
the first step like for someone who wants to restore that intimacy after betrayal?
Well, the first step, usually for the person who has been betrayed, the first step is getting over the shock
Mm.
because, kind of
Okay.
implicit in that notion of betrayal is it's shocking. If, you can be hurt by
Yeah.
someone, but if you have a
Mhm.
relationship where you would think they would never have done that, that's what I mean by
Mhm.
betrayal. So there's always an element of shock. There's an element of almost always an element of self-blame. People will say, "Why didn't I
Mhm.
see this coming?" or "Why didn't I stop it?" or
Yeah.
"How could I have been so stupid?" or whatever it is. And so that, the earlier phases, getting over the shock
Mhm.
and then finding a way to forgive. And by forgive, I don't necessarily mean restoring trust. You can forgive somebody that you have no intention of trusting,
Mhm.
but forgive just in the sense of getting past the obsession with it, getting past the shock, getting past the anger, getting to the point
Mhm.
where you can accept, okay, I wish this hadn't happened, but it did.
Yeah.
And there's something, you know, apparently we were headed for this even though we didn't realize it.
Mhm.
That's what it feels like when people get to that point of forgiveness. They can say, "All right, I can forgive myself. I can forgive the person who did it even though they shouldn't have done it, but at least I can say, well, I don't have to be angry about it anymore.
Yeah.
I can try and understand it even though I may not want to stay with the person." So that getting to the point where you actually want to restore intimacy
Mhm.
involves, first of all, getting to that level of forgiveness where you could even think
Yeah.
about that. And then you have to worry about, okay, can we restore trust?
Mm.
And that's not just, forgiveness is an inside job. Forgiveness is just the person doing the forgiving. You can forgive somebody who doesn't deserve it in any sense. That's Forgiveness is about letting go of the anger yourself. But trust is a two-person job. That
True.
involves both parties understanding enough what happened that they can say, wow, I can imagine trusting someone who had done that to me because the situation is different. We've learned what we need to learn.
Mm.
People end up often grateful for what they learned for going through it, even though it's
Yes.
betrayal is an awful experience.
Mm. True. Exactly true. Wow. And uh, also like regarding forgiveness, um, is forgiveness a goal or maybe a process, or is it something entirely different? So, what do you say?
But yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it is a goal. It's not something, nobody else can tell a person when they need to forgive.
Mhm.
I mean, they can tell them if, friends are often pressuring people either to forgive or not to forgive. It doesn't really do much good. I do tend to think forgiveness is a necessary part of healing. If you haven't forgiven, you're still burdened. So I tend to think of it as a goal in that sense. It's like, yeah, it's a good place to get to so that you're no longer burdened by what happened. And then you can think clearly about it. But the timing of that, I have a whole chapter in the book talking about when it's a bad idea to forgive. If you're in the middle of a relationship where you're still being hurt, you don't need to let go of the anger. You need to get out or you need to do something to change the situation. So, you may need that anger. You may need that sense of panic that happens when you think about it, because that's the motivation to get out of it. So it is a goal, but how long it takes to get there varies with the individual.
Mm, true. Exactly. So, wow. So I have heard people say like forgive and forget.
Mm.
Uh, but your work suggests like remembering wisely might be more honest and even more healing. So, I definitely wanted to understand. I mean, if you can share a bit.
Oh, of course. Yeah. I mean, that concept I have, of course, we've
Mhm.
all heard that expression, forgive and forget. To me, that's nonsense. It,
Mhm.
if you've actually forgotten something, there's nothing to
Mm.
forgive.
Yeah.
I've seen that come up. It hasn't happened to me, but I think my wife was telling me about this. She went to a high school reunion,
Mhm.
decades after being in high school, and somebody apologized to her for having been kind of a jerk in high school. And she had no memory of it whatever. She wasn't walking around burdened by this. It's like there was nothing to forgive. She didn't remember it. It was something that she had long since just said, "Oh, what the heck? It didn't matter." So
Okay.
that forgive and forget really is kind of
Mhm.
nonsense. But forgive exactly what you said. I like that idea of sort of remembering wisely.
Mm.
That really I hadn't heard thought of that term, but it's a great term
Mm.
because it is about remembering, and that's what I mentioned a minute ago that
Mm.
when a couple has gone through this,
Mm.
they will often express gratitude. I've never heard anybody say, "Hey, thanks for cheating." Haven't heard that one yet. I have numbers of times, and
Yeah.
not that one doesn't come up, but numbers of times I have heard people say something like,
Uh,
"Hey, you know what? Thanks for precipitating the crisis we needed. We didn't realize we needed it, but apparently we did. Look how much better off we are now. Look how much greater our sense of intimacy is now." That I've seen that a lot. And that's that sense of gratitude that can happen. So, that's
mm.
not forgive and forget. That is forgive and grow. And
True.
it's really lovely when that happens. Of course, I've also worked with lots of couples where they can
Mhm.
forgive, but what they realized having gone through the crisis is, wow, we are two fine people, but we're not right for each other.
Mm.
And then that's a solution as well. It's maybe it's a sadder one, but that's every bit as much a solution.
Exactly. Yeah. Agree. Agree. Wow. And when you often say that your approach boils down to be kind, don't panic, and have faith.
Yes.
And yeah, and that last part, like have faith, um, can feel kind of abstract sometimes. But what does mean in the practical terms for a couple
Yeah.
who are on the age? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the key point right there. That's
Mm.
my 7 words, be kind, don't panic, and have faith. You have to count "and" to get
Mhm.
7 there.
Mm.
Yeah, have faith. What I mean by faith, I mean it in a pretty general sense. I'm not talking about necessarily religious faith, although it sometimes
Okay.
fits with some people's religious faith. Sometimes
Mm.
doesn't, though. What I mean by faith is to have that deep sense of acceptance that reality somehow, even when it's painful, is right to be what it is. There's some rightness about it. That's what I mean by faith. So when a couple can experience that sense of faith, The couples
Mm.
that come in, for example, let's say there's been infidelity, which is a very common
Huh.
feature of folks that I meet in my practice.
Yeah.
The couples that come in and say, "Oh, this is terrible. We just want to go back to how it was. This is awful." The person who cheated is feeling terrible and saying, "I'll never do it again." And the other person saying, "You're damn right, you'll never do it again." They're really upset. But they come in and say, "We just want to go back to how it was." They are not showing faith, oddly enough, and they tend to
Mm.
have a hard time. The couples that come in and say, "This is awful. We are both feeling terrible, but we
Mm.
there must be something meaningful about this. Apparently something was going wrong." They are showing faith. They are saying, "Wow, there's something about this we can learn from, even though it's painful, even though there was wrong behavior involved." That's
Mm.
you don't have to jettison morality to appreciate
Mm.
this. There must be meaning there. The person who did the cheating will say things like, "I never would have thought I've done that. How could I have done that?" But that
Mm.
doesn't end the conversation, it begins it. It's like, "Okay, let's look at how you could have done that. Let's assume you're not a terrible person." That's a statement of faith as well, by the
Mm.
way. The people I work with in general are not crazy, evil, or stupid. They're regular old people like we all are.
Yeah.
And so that's all of that is about faith, and that's what lets you not panic, which is let you restore a sense of kinship, which is what I mean by be kind. So
Mm.
faith is really the key to it. And your question about, gee, how do you do that in practice? I don't have a
Yeah.
simple answer to, how does one acquire faith as if it were some sort of thing you could take a pill for? You can't. It's a practice.
Yeah.
It's a sort of spiritual practice. It's a practice
Mm.
that says, okay, I'm going to start with that assumption that
Mm.
we're all right to be who we are, even when things are going badly, and then work with
Yeah.
that. And that's a practice. And how do you acquire that? How do you learn
Mm.
to do that? Ideally, I think if people are in couples therapy, what the therapist is providing, probably more than anything else, is that
Mm.
faith. The therapist is saying, okay, let's assume that you are decent people. Let's assume that you're not crazy. You
Mm.
start with that. And let's proceed with that in mind. And that often lets people find the courage to proceed. It's like, wow, this is awful, but boy, we're learning from it.
Mm.
So that all of that is kind of wrapped up in the idea of faith.
Lovely. That's really lovely. Yeah. And so this might sounds contradictory, but it's actually not. Like, um, uh, what if betrayal isn't always a deal breaker? I mean, uh,
Mhm.
but a kind of wake up call. So, can betrayal ever strengthen a relationship? I mean, if
Oh,
it's
oh, yeah,
handled with brutal honesty.
absolutely. Of course, I do point out, I never recommend, oh, I know
Uh,
a way to strengthen your relationship. Go ahead and cheat on your
uh,
partner. Not a good plan. I don't recommend,
exactly.
but absolutely what you said. Very often, betrayal turns into a wake up call. And when it does, they're going to be better off together or separate. They'll be better off.
Mm.
But when they're together, it is the only way a couple stays together, usually. Actually, I don't want to overstate it, but the only way
Mm.
a couple stays together after a betrayal is when things are better than they were before.
Yes.
Because that look where things were before. It led to the betrayal. I mean, it was the conditions that led to the betrayal. So when a couple survives that, again, I mentioned those are the ones who are expressing gratitude. It's like, wow, I guess we needed that. Hey, it was awful, but apparently we needed that.
Mm. Wow. That's amazing. So great. Really, really great. So, Dr. Bruce, I mean, thank you so much for that deep, real, and so needed discussion. Um, I mean, uh, that intimacy isn't a kind of destination; it's a practice. So, thank you so much for sharing that. And if today's episode started something in you, dear listeners, then don't wait. Talk about it with your partner, your therapist, or even with yourself in the mirror. You deserve intimacy that feels alive. So, Dr. Bruce, like if someone wants to connect with you, what will be the best medium to connect?
Easiest way is just go to my website, which is simply brucechalmer.com. So if you spell my name right, you'll get it. BruceChalmer, brucechalmer.com. And that'll get you information about my books. It'll get information about the podcast I do with my wife, which is called Couples Therapy in 7 Words. You mentioned the 7 words earlier. and also information about my practice, which I do a telehealth practice.
That's amazing. Great. Lovely. Great. So, dear listeners, I'll put all the links into the show notes for your easy reference. And if you have loved this episode, share it with someone who needs to hear that intimacy isn't lost, just waiting to be reignited. So, with this hope, this is your host, Avik, signing off from Pleasure Principles. Till then, be happy, stay mindful. Thank you so much.